The notification light on Nick's phone pulsed in the darkness, casting a faint blue glow across their bedroom. Emily watched it blink, each flash like a heartbeat counting the seconds until dawn. She'd woken to the sound of his fingers tapping against the screen, a rhythm she'd grown accustomed to over the past few months. 10 years of marriage had taught her the cadence of his breathing when he truly slept, and this wasn't it. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:47 a.m. Nick lay on his side, facing away from her, his shoulder curved protectively around the phone. The soft light of the screen illuminated his profile, creating shadows that made him look like a stranger. Emily closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, but her mind raced with questions she couldn't voice. Their marriage had always been solid, or at least that's what she'd believed. They'd weathered the typical storms, career changes, family drama, the loss of Nick's father 3 years ago. Through it all, they'd remained a team. But lately, something had shifted, as subtle as seasons changing. It wasn't anything she could point to definitively, just a growing collection of small moments that didn't quite fit the pattern of their life together. Nick spent more time on his phone, angled away from her view. He'd started taking work calls in the garage or backyard, claiming the house had too much echo. His social media presence had expanded, though he'd always been the type to post once every few months, usually about their hiking trips or home renovation projects. Emily rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotation. The morning would bring another day at the architectural firm where she'd worked for the past 8 years. Nick would head to his IT consulting job, where he managed remote teams across different time zones, a convenient explanation for all the odd-hour messages and calls. "Everything okay?" she whispered into the darkness. Nick's typing paused. "Just work stuff, hon, go back to sleep." His voice carried the practiced ease of someone who'd given the same answer many times before. Emily remembered when they used to stay up late talking about everything and nothing, their dreams, their fears, the ridiculous reality TV shows they pretended not to watch. Now their late-night conversations had been replaced by the soft glow of screens and carefully crafted excuses. The next morning unfolded like any other. Emily prepared coffee while Nick showered, the routine so familiar she could do it blindfolded. The kitchen radio played soft jazz, filling the silence between them. When Nick emerged, dressed in his usual business casual attire, he kissed her cheek and grabbed his travel mug. "Meeting with the Singapore team this morning," he explained, checking his phone. "Might be late tonight." Emily nodded, clutching her own coffee mug. "I was thinking we could try that new Italian place this weekend. The one Sarah recommended." "Sure, sounds good." Nick's attention remained on his phone as he gathered his keys and laptop bag. "I'll check my calendar and let you know." After he left, Emily sat at their kitchen island, surrounded by the morning light streaming through the windows they'd installed together 3 summers ago. She opened her laptop, intending to review project proposals, but found herself staring at Nick's Facebook profile instead. The public version showed what everyone else saw: their vacation photos, home improvement updates, the occasional shared meme about IT life. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of place. Yet something compelled her to keep scrolling, searching for clues to explain the growing distance between them. A notification popped up: Sarah, her best friend since college, messaging about their weekly lunch date. Emily clicked over to respond, but her finger hesitated over the keyboard. How could she explain her concerns without sounding paranoid? How could she voice the fear growing in her chest when she had nothing concrete to point to? She typed out a casual response about meeting at their usual spot, then returned to her work emails. But throughout the morning, her mind kept wandering back to Nick's phone glowing in the darkness, to the way he angled his screen away from her, to the growing collection of small moments that felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. That evening, as Emily drove home from work, she took the long route through their neighborhood. The autumn leaves had started to turn, painting the streets in shades of gold and crimson. She remembered their first autumn in this house, how they'd spent weekends raking leaves together, making plans for the future. Now those memories felt like photographs fading at the edges, their colors washing out to leave behind shadows of what used to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nick, "Meeting running long. Don't wait up for dinner." Emily parked in their driveway, staring at the message. The house loomed before her, dark and quiet. Inside, she knew she'd find more questions than answers, more silence than conversation. But as she gathered her belongings and headed toward the front door, she caught a glimpse of movement in the living room window, the blue glow of a laptop screen she'd forgotten to shut down that morning. And there, in the browser history she hadn't meant to check, was the first thread that would begin to unravel everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Emily's hands trembled as she scrolled through the browser history. Each click revealed another piece of the puzzle she hadn't wanted to solve. Nick had created a separate social media profile, one she'd never seen before. The profile picture showed him in a suit at last year's company party, but the name was different, Nicholas Matthews, not Nicholas Warner. Their shared last name, the one they'd sworn to honor together a decade ago, had been quietly erased. The cursor hovered over the profile link. Emily felt the weight of 10 years pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The house creaked around her, settling into the evening darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. She jumped, quickly minimizing the browser window, though she knew Nick wouldn't be home for hours. "This isn't happening," she whispered to the empty room. But the evidence remained, pixels on a screen that couldn't be wished away. With shaking fingers, she reopened the browser and began to read. The other profile wasn't particularly active, just a handful of posts about technology and career development. But the messages. Emily's throat tightened as she clicked through the conversations. Nick had been chatting with several women, their exchanges filled with playful banter and inside jokes. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, but the familiarity in their words felt like a betrayal. One name appeared more frequently than others, Lauren Mitchell. Their conversations spanned months, starting with discussions about programming languages and gradually evolving into more personal territory. They shared music recommendations, complained about work stress, and exchanged book suggestions. It was the kind of easy intimacy that Emily and Nick used to have, before screens and secrets had crept between them. Emily closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, her movements mechanical. She filled a glass with water, watching the liquid rise until it nearly overflowed. 10 years of marriage played through her mind like a highlights reel, their backpacking honeymoon in New Zealand, the weekend they'd spent painting their first apartment, the quiet mornings sharing coffee and dreams. Had it all been building to this moment? Her phone buzzed, another message from Nick, "Ordered takeout. Save you some." The casual normality of his text made her want to scream. Instead, she typed back, "Already ate. Don't worry about it." 3 dots appeared as he started to respond, then disappeared. Emily imagined him in some conference room, surrounded by glowing screens and empty coffee cups, living a life she no longer fully understood. The next morning, she called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Nick had already left early for another meeting, leaving behind the ghost of his aftershave and a half-empty coffee mug in the sink. Emily sat at her laptop again, this time methodically documenting everything she found. Each message, each interaction, each small deception carefully catalogued in a spreadsheet that grew longer by the hour. Sarah called around noon, concerned by her absence from their usual lunch spot. You okay? You never miss work." Emily stared at the spreadsheet, at the patterns emerging from the data. Nick's late nights corresponded perfectly with Lauren's activity online. Their conversations intensified during weekends when Emily visited her mother or attended architecture conferences. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Just a migraine." "You sure? You sound off." A message notification popped up on her screen, Nick checking in, "Hope you feel better, hon, need me to pick up anything on the way home?" Emily closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. Have you ever looked at someone's browser history and found something you wish you hadn't? The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. Oh, Em. What did you find? I don't know yet, Emily whispered, opening her eyes to stare at the spreadsheet again. But I think my marriage isn't what I thought it was. That evening, when Nick came home, Emily had already rehearsed a dozen different confrontations in her mind. But watching him move through their kitchen, humming absently as he reheated leftover takeout, she couldn't find the words. He looked exactly the same, her husband of 10 years, the man who still wrote silly notes in her birthday cards and knew exactly how she liked her coffee. Yet somehow, he was also a stranger named Nicholas Matthews who shared his innermost thoughts with a woman named Lauren while his wife slept alone. Feeling any better? Nick asked, sitting beside her on the couch with his plate. The television murmured in the background, some reality show they used to watch together. Emily nodded, clutching her own dinner like a shield. Nick, she began, her voice barely audible, do you remember what you said in your wedding vows? He looked up, surprised by the question. Of course. Why? You promised there would never be secrets between us. Emily set her plate down, turning to face him fully. Did you mean it? Nick's fork paused halfway to his mouth. In the blue light of the TV screen, she watched something flicker across his face, guilt, fear, or maybe just surprise. But before he could respond, his phone lit up with a notification. They both looked down at the screen, where a message preview showed a familiar name, Lauren Mitchell. The silence that followed was deafening. The days following Emily's discovery unfolded like scenes from someone else's life. She moved through their home in a daze, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt foreign, the framed wedding photos in the hallway, Nick's coffee mug with its chip on the rim, the throw blanket they'd bought together on their last anniversary. Each item held memories that now seemed to belong to different people, to a different version of their marriage. Sarah's living room became her sanctuary. The worn leather couch had witnessed countless conversations over wine and ice cream, but none quite like this. Emily sat cross-legged, clutching a barely touched glass of Merlot, while Sarah listened to the whole story. I keep thinking I must have missed something, Emily said, staring into her wine. Some sign, some moment when everything started to change. But it's like trying to pinpoint the exact second leaves start turning in autumn, you just look up one day and everything's different. Sarah leaned forward, her face etched with concern. Have you confronted him about Lauren? Not directly. Every time I try, the words get stuck. Emily set down her glass, watching the wine catch the afternoon light. He knows something's wrong. He's been hovering, trying to act normal, but there's this tension now. Like we're both holding our breath, waiting for the other to speak first. Maybe, Sarah suggested carefully, it's not what it seems. You said the messages weren't exactly romantic. No, they weren't. But they were intimate in a different way. Emily closed her eyes, remembering the conversations she'd read. He tells her things, Sarah. About his dreams, his fears, things he used to tell me. When did I stop being the person he wanted to share those parts of himself with? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Outside, a neighbor's wind chimes created a gentle melody that reminded Emily of the ones that used to hang on their back porch, before the storm last spring had destroyed them. Nick had promised to replace them, but somehow they never had. Remember when Tom and I separated? Sarah's voice was gentle. Everyone thought they knew exactly what went wrong, what we should have done differently. But the truth was messier than anyone could see from the outside. Emily nodded, remembering those difficult months when Sarah's marriage had unraveled. She'd been so certain then about what her friend should do, about the clear line between right and wrong. Now, sitting on the same couch where they'd planned Sarah's new life, everything seemed more complicated. I don't want to lose him, Emily whispered, the admission feeling like both a surrender and a declaration of war. But I don't know how to keep him without losing myself in the process. That evening, she drove home slowly, taking the long route through their old neighborhood. They'd rented their first apartment there, a tiny one-bedroom above a bookstore. She remembered how Nick used to bring her coffee in bed every Sunday morning, how they'd spend hours planning their future in whispered conversations, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of their happiness. The house was dark when she arrived, but Nick's car was in the driveway. She found him in their home office, surrounded by the blue glow of multiple monitors. He turned when she entered, and for a moment, she saw him as both stranger and husband, the man who'd promised to share his life with her, and the man who'd created a separate digital life beyond her reach. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Nick nodded, closing his laptop. In the sudden dimness, his face looked older, tired. "I know." Emily sat in the spare office chair, the one that squeaked slightly when it turned. The sound reminded her of late nights working side by side, sharing dreams and fears across their matching desks. Now the space between them felt like an ocean. "I found your other profile," she began, watching his expression carefully. "Nicholas Matthews." His face didn't register surprise, only resignation. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to understand that while I've been worried about losing my husband, you've already been slowly disappearing." Nick's hands moved restlessly on the desk, arranging and rearranging a stack of post-it notes. "It's not what you think, Em." "Then tell me what it is," she challenged, her voice cracking slightly. "Tell me why my husband needs a secret identity to talk to other women. Tell me why Lauren Mitchell knows more about your thoughts and feelings than I do these days." The name hung between them like a physical presence. Nick's shoulders tensed, then slumped. "Lauren is Dash." "Don't," Emily interrupted. "Don't tell me she's just a friend. Don't tell me I'm overreacting. Just, tell me the truth. When did I stop being enough?" The question seemed to hit Nick like a physical blow. He pushed back from the desk, running his hands through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made Emily's heart ache. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. "You've never stopped being enough, Em. I'm the one who hasn't been enough." Outside, a car alarm started wailing in the distance, its rhythmic shriek cutting through the night. Emily waited, her heart pounding in her throat, as Nick struggled to find his next words. In the dim light of the office, surrounded by the technology that had both connected and divided them, they stood on the precipice of either saving their marriage or watching it crumble completely. The silence in their home office felt like a living thing, breathing between them as Nick gathered his thoughts. Emily watched the shadows play across his face, remembering all the times she'd studied those same features in moments of joy, of passion, of quiet contentment. Now, she searched for traces of the man she'd married in this stranger who'd been slowly withdrawing into a digital world. After Dad died, Nick finally began, his voice barely above a whisper, "Something broke inside me. Not just grief, I'd dealt with that before. This was different. It was like I couldn't be the person everyone needed me to be anymore. The strong one. The reliable one. The one who always knew what to do." Emily's hands tightened in her lap, fighting the instinct to reach out to him. "You never had to be strong all the time, Nick. Not with me." He laughed, a hollow sound that held no humor. "That's just it, Em. You've always seen the best in me. Even when I was falling apart, you believed in me so completely that I couldn't bear to let you see how lost I really was." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Emily thought about all the times she'd praised his resilience, his strength in handling his father's estate, his ability to keep working through the grief. Had her faith in him become another burden he carried? "Lauren." Nick continued, then paused, weighing his words carefully. "She was just someone who didn't know me before. Someone who had no expectations. I could be messy, uncertain, angry, and she didn't compare that version of me to who I used to be. And I did." Emily's voice cracked slightly. "Is that what you think?" "No, God no. Nick turned to face her fully, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You loved me through everything. That's what made it harder. Every time you looked at me with such trust, such certainty that I was still the same man you married. I felt like I was betraying you just by existing differently than before. The truth of his words settled in Emily's chest like stones. She remembered the months after Robert's death, how she'd constantly reassured Nick that he was handling everything beautifully, that he was so strong. Had she left any room for him to be anything else? The separate profile started as just a way to join some grief support forums, Nick continued. I didn't want to worry you by posting about Dad on my regular account. But then it became this space where I could be completely honest about how scared and lost I felt. Lauren lost her mother 2 years ago. She understood the way grief changes you, makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. Emily stood abruptly, needing to move, to process. She walked to the window, looking out at their darkened backyard. The garden they'd planted together had gone wild in recent months, neither of them maintaining it like they used to. Another small sign she'd missed. Why couldn't you tell me this? She asked, still facing the window. When did I become someone you needed to protect rather than confide in? Because I love the way you see me, Nick's voice was thick with emotion. And I was terrified that if you saw how broken I really was, that image would shatter. That you'd realize I'm not the man you thought you married. Emily turned back to him, really looking at her husband for what felt like the first time in months. The slump in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, all the signs she'd attributed to work stress or late nights now took on a different meaning. Nick, she said softly, taking a step toward him, I didn't marry an image. I married you. All of you. The strong parts and the broken parts. The certainty and the doubt. Everything. He looked up at her, vulnerability raw on his face. I never meant to fall into an emotional affair. That's what it was, even if nothing physical ever happened. I shared parts of myself with her that should have been yours, and I can't take that back. The word affair landed like a physical blow, but Emily forced herself to stay present, to really hear what Nick was saying. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about grief, about identity, about the ways trauma can isolate people even in the midst of their closest relationships. Where do we go from here? She asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. How do we find our way back to each other? Nick stood slowly, crossing the space between them with careful steps. I don't know, he admitted. But I want to try. I want to be honest with you about everything, the grief, the fear, the person I'm becoming. Even if it means you might not like what you see. Emily reached out, touching his face gently. Under her fingers, she felt the slight stubble of his beard, the familiar contours that had changed so subtly over their years together. Then show me, she whispered. Show me who you are now. Let me love that person too. As they stood there in the darkness of their home office, surrounded by the technology that had both connected and divided them, Emily realized they were standing on the edge of something new. Not the end of their marriage, but perhaps the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one built on the understanding that love isn't about maintaining perfect images, but about making space for each other's evolution, even when it hurts. Nick's phone buzzed on the desk behind them, the screen lighting up with another message. This time, neither of them turned to look. The healing began in small moments, quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. Emily noticed how Nick started leaving his phone face up on the kitchen counter while making coffee, a silent offering of transparency. She observed the way his shoulders relaxed when she sat beside him in the evenings, no longer carrying the weight of unspoken secrets. One Sunday morning, Emily woke to find Nick in their overgrown garden, pulling weeds with the same intense focus he once gave to his screens. His hands were covered in dirt, his old college t-shirt damp with sweat. She brought him water, settling onto the ground beside him. I forgot how much Dad loved gardening, he said softly, accepting the glass. He used to say you could solve any problem if you just spent enough time with your hands in the earth. I thought it was just another one of his sayings, you know. But now. Emily watched as he trailed off, his fingers absently tracing patterns in the soil. Tell me more about him, she encouraged. Tell me the things you haven't been able to say. And there, among the tangled remnants of their neglected garden, Nick began to speak. He talked about the last conversation he'd had with his father, about the regret of not visiting more often, about the dreams where Robert still lived and Nick couldn't warn him about the heart attack that would take him away. His voice broke several times, but he kept going, finally releasing the grief he'd tried so hard to contain. Emily listened, really listened, not trying to fix or comfort or reassure. She let his pain exist without trying to diminish it, understanding now that sometimes love meant simply bearing witness to someone's struggles. Later that week, they sat together in their first couples therapy session. The office was warm and inviting, with soft lighting that made everything feel less clinical. Dr. Martinez, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, asked them to describe their marriage in 3 words. Evolving, Emily said after a long pause. Resilient. Unfinished. Nick's eyes met hers across the space between their chairs. Healing, he offered. Complex. Worth fighting for. The sessions became a weekly ritual, a protected space where they could unravel the knots in their communication. They learned that grief hadn't just changed Nick, it had transformed them both, altering the carefully constructed patterns of their relationship. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez explained, we build our marriages on unspoken expectations, on roles we think we need to play. When life forces us to change those roles, it can feel like everything is falling apart. But maybe it's just making space for something new to emerge. At home, they began their own rituals of reconnection. Every evening, they spent an hour together with all screens turned off. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, sometimes they simply existed in the same space while doing different activities. The important part wasn't what they did, but the intentional choice to be present with each other. Nick deleted his alternate social media profile, but not before showing Emily all of his conversations with Lauren. It hurt to read them, to see the depth of emotional intimacy they'd shared, but it was a necessary pain. Understanding the full scope of what had happened helped Emily process her feelings of betrayal and loss. I've ended our friendship, Nick told her one evening, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset. Lauren understood. She said she'd been feeling guilty about our connection for a while now. Emily nodded, processing this information. Do you regret it? Being honest with me about everything? Nick turned to look at her, his face open and vulnerable in the fading light. The only thing I regret is not being honest sooner. Living with secrets, it's like trying to breathe underwater. You can do it for a while, with the right equipment, but eventually you have to come up for air. Their moments of intimacy began to feel different, more raw, more real. When Nick cried while sorting through his father's old photographs, Emily didn't try to soothe his tears away. Instead, she sat with him, looking at each picture, listening to the stories he needed to tell. When she expressed her own fears about their future, he didn't rush to reassure her. He acknowledged her pain, her uncertainty, her right to feel everything she was feeling. One night, as they lay in bed, Emily reached for Nick's hand in the darkness. I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said about expectations, she whispered. About how we sometimes love the idea of someone more than their reality. Nick's fingers tightened around hers. And I'm learning to love you as you are now, not as you were, not as I wish you would be, but as you are in this moment. Even the broken parts. Especially the broken parts. The silence that followed wasn't empty like before. It was full of understanding, of acceptance, of the kind of love that grows stronger for having been tested. Outside their window, the wind chimes they'd finally replaced sang softly in the night breeze, their melody no less beautiful for being different from the ones that came before. 6 months after their first therapy session, Emily stood in their garden, watching the early morning light paint shadows across the new growth. The plants they'd carefully tended together were starting to thrive again, much like their marriage, not returning to what it was before, but growing into something different, perhaps stronger for having weathered the storm. Nick emerged from the house carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, just as he had countless mornings before. But now, there was a deliberate quality to his movements, a mindfulness that hadn't existed during their years of comfortable routine. He handed her a mug, the chipped one she'd always favored, and stood beside her, their shoulders barely touching. "I had that dream again last night," he said quietly, watching a chickadee land on their newly installed bird feeder. "The one where Dad and I are working on his old Chevy. But this time, instead of trying to warn him about what's coming, I just sat with him. Listened to him talk about carburetors and spark plugs. It felt peaceful." Emily reached for his free hand, interlacing their fingers. These morning conversations had become sacred, a time when they could share their deepest truths without fear. Sometimes they talked about Robert, about the complexity of grief that still surfaced in unexpected moments. Sometimes they discussed their own relationship, the ongoing work of rebuilding trust and intimacy. Often, they simply existed together in comfortable silence, each secure in the knowledge that they were truly seen and accepted by the other. "Dr. Martinez asked me an interesting question yesterday," Emily said, sipping her coffee. "She wanted to know if I would choose this version of our marriage, if I had the chance to go back and prevent everything that happened." Nick's hand tightened slightly in hers. "And what did you say?" "I told her that's the wrong question. We can't go backward, and honestly, I don't want to. What we had before was beautiful, but it was also fragile in ways we couldn't see. We were so careful to maintain this perfect image of ourselves, of our relationship, that we didn't leave room for the messy parts of being human." A gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes, their melody mixing with the morning birdsong. Nick set his mug down on the garden wall and turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about deleting all my social media accounts," he said. "Not because I don't trust myself, but because I'm realizing how much of my life I was experiencing through a screen, always crafting this curated version of reality instead of just living it." Emily studied his face in the morning light, noting the new lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his temples. They had both aged during this journey, but there was a depth to him now that made her heart ache with love, not the comfortable, familiar love of their early marriage, but something more complex and profound. "We don't have to be perfect," she reminded him, echoing words they'd both learned to embrace. "We just have to be real." Inside the house, their phones lay silent on the kitchen counter. There would be time later for work emails, for digital connections, for the necessary engagement with the modern world. But these morning moments belonged to them alone, unfiltered and unmediated by screens. "I found some of Dad's old letters yesterday," Nick said, his voice soft with memory. Real letters, handwritten on actual paper. He wrote to Mom every day when he was away on business trips. Even if nothing special happened, he'd just write about his day, his thoughts, how much he missed her. "I never knew about them until I found them in that box in the attic." Emily leaned into him slightly. "Maybe that's something we could try. Not letters exactly, but finding our own way to stay connected that doesn't involve keyboards and screens." "I'd like that," Nick smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way his smiles hadn't for a long time. "Maybe we could start with that garden journal you've been talking about. Document everything we plant, watch it grow together." They spent the rest of the morning working side by side in the garden, their phones forgotten inside. Nick told stories about his father's gardening mishaps, laughing genuinely as he remembered Robert's infamous battle with an particularly stubborn rosebush. Emily shared her own memories of learning to grow tomatoes from her grandmother, the satisfaction of nurturing something from seed to fruit. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they sat back to admire their work. The garden was far from perfect, some plants were still struggling, others growing in unexpected directions. But it was alive, authentic, a true reflection of the care they'd invested in it. "You know what I've learned through all of this?" Emily said, brushing dirt from her jeans. Love isn't about never making mistakes or never feeling lost. It's about choosing to face those moments together, about creating a space where we can both be completely ourselves, messy, uncertain, evolving, but always reaching toward each other. Nick reached over and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, his touch lingering with tenderness. "I choose you," he said simply. "Every day, in every version of ourselves, I choose you." In that moment, surrounded by the garden they were bringing back to life together, Emily felt the full weight of their journey, the pain, the growth, the deeper understanding they'd fought so hard to achieve. Their marriage wasn't perfect, and never would be. But it was real, it was theirs, and it was worth every difficult step they'd taken to save it. Above them, the morning sun continued its arc across the sky, warming the earth and coaxing new growth from the soil. Like the garden around them, their love had weathered its season of dormancy and emerged different but vibrant, ready to grow in whatever direction the future might hold.